Redundant. That's what they called me. Like I was some outdated printer, collecting dust in the supply closet. Karen, from Human Resources, delivered the news with all the warmth of a parking ticket, slapped under your windshield wiper on a rainy Tuesday morning. We're restructuring, she said. Like restructuring was some kind of noble quest instead of corporate. Speak for? We found someone younger who'll work for peanuts and energy drinks. Your position has been deemed redundant, which was rich, considering I was the only person in that godforsaken office who knew where anything was, digitally speaking. But sure, Karen, let's call it redundant. She handed me a folder, thick as a phone book, and about as useful, containing my severance package, COBRA information, and a passive-aggressive reminder about returning company property, which was hilarious because nobody in that place even knew what company property I had access to. They thought company property meant my laptop and maybe the Bluetooth mouse I'd been using since Obama was president. They had no idea I was walking out with the digital keys to the kingdom. 8 years. I gave them 8 years of building systems, maintaining databases, and creating the digital infrastructure that kept their precious little empire from collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. And they thanked me with a manila folder and a security escort, like I was some kind of flight risk, instead of the person who'd been holding their entire operation together with duct tape and sheer willpower. The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a butter knife and serve it at their next team-building lunch, where they'd probably discuss synergy and paradigm shifts while eating sad desk salads. If you're nodding along, because you've been there too, hit that subscribe button, because misery loves company. And I'm building an army of the professionally discarded 97% of people watching don't subscribe, which is fine, because 97% of people also think loyalty means something. In corporate America, spoiler alert, it doesn't. The security guard walked me out like I was carrying state secrets instead of a cardboard box containing a wilted succulent and a stress ball shaped like a donut that had lost its squeeze somewhere around year 3. I smiled and waved goodbye to my former colleagues who watched through the glass like I was being led to execution, which in corporate terms, I suppose, I was. They had no idea they were watching their own funeral procession, because without me, that place was about to become a digital ghost town. And I was the only one holding the map to resurrection. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people reveal exactly how little they understand about what you actually do. Karen sat there in her synthetic blazer from the clearance rack at Nordstrom Rack, explaining my own job to me, like I was a toddler who'd just discovered crayons. Your responsibilities will be redistributed among the team, she said, with the confidence of someone who'd never opened a command prompt in her life, which was amazing because the team she was referring to consisted of David, who still asked me how to attach files to emails, Jessica, who thought clearing cache meant deleting her browsing history, and Marcus, who once spent 3 hours trying to figure out why his computer wouldn't turn on before realizing it wasn't plugged in. These were the people who were going to redistribute my responsibilities, like dividing up a NASA mission between a group of goldfish. But Karen had spoken. The budget had been optimized, synergies had been leveraged, and I was redundant. Case closed. She didn't ask what systems I maintained. She didn't inquire about documentation or transition plans. She didn't even bother to find out what passwords I had access to. Because in Karen's world, it was just a department you could outsource to some kid with a computer science degree and a YouTube channel. She had no concept that I wasn't just maintaining systems. I was the nervous system, the digital spine, the invisible infrastructure that kept their entire operation breathing, eating, and excreting money into their quarterly reports. But ignorance is bliss. Right up until the moment reality comes knocking with a sledgehammer and a foreclosure. Notice I walked out of that building with my head high, my severance package tucked under my arm, and 8 years' worth of passwords burned into my memory like the combination to a safe they didn't even know existed. The first hint of trouble should have come when they asked me to document my systems during the transition period. Oh wait, they didn't ask. They just assumed someone else would figure it out, because that's how corporate restructuring works. You fire the person who knows how everything works, then act surprised when everything stops working. It's like firing the pilot mid-flight and expecting the passengers to land the plane through collaborative brainstorming and positive thinking. I spent the next few days in a weird, liminal space between employment and unemployment, sleeping late, making elaborate breakfasts, and pretending I was on some kind of sabbatical instead of being professionally discarded like a broken stapler. The severance was decent enough to keep me afloat for a few months, but not generous enough to feel like compensation for nearly a decade of digital servitude. Mostly, I felt empty, like someone had scooped out my professional identity with a rusty spoon and left me with a shell that looked like a person, but felt hollow when you tap on it. Then came the calls. Not the job. Recruiters or former colleagues checking in. No, these were panic calls, distress signals from a sinking ship whose crew had just realized they'd thrown their navigator overboard and forgotten to ask for the maps. The first one came on a Thursday, exactly 72 hours after my departure. I was sitting in my kitchen, eating cereal, straight from the box, and contemplating whether Netflix counted as professional development when my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. The number was local, but unfamiliar. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity killed the cat, and satisfaction was about to bring it back. Sarah, thank God you answered. The voice belonged to Jessica from accounting, who sounded like she'd been crying into her keyboard for hours. I know I'm not supposed to be calling you, but we have a situation. Nobody can access the payroll system, and it's supposed to run tomorrow morning. Karen's having some kind of breakdown in her office, and she told me to figure it out, but I don't even know where to start. I almost laughed, the bitter, ironic kind of laugh that escapes when the universe reveals its sense of humor. That's terrible, Jessica, I said, with all the sincerity of a telemarketer, reading from a script. You should probably contact your IT department. Oh, wait, I paused for dramatic effect. That's right, I was the IT department, and I was redundant. Remember, Karen made that very clear. There was silence on the other end, the kind of silence that fills a morgue. At midnight, then, Jessica said, in a voice smaller than a whisper, Sarah, please, we really need your help. The employees are expecting their paychecks tomorrow, and if payroll doesn't run, people are going to quit. And I'll need you to define we, Jessica, because according to my termination paperwork, I don't work there anymore. In fact, according to Karen, I was never really necessary to begin with, so I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're all very smart people. I'm confident you can Google your way through this one. I hung up and went back to my cereal, but somehow it tasted sweeter, like revenge-flavored cornflakes. The calls kept coming with increasing frequency and desperation. David from sales couldn't access the customer relationship management system and had 3 major client presentations scheduled for the week. Marcus from marketing was locked out of every social media platform an email automation tool. And apparently, nobody could remember how to log into the company's cloud storage, where all their promotional materials lived. Each call was a small masterpiece of corporate panic, painted in the vivid colors of consequences they'd never considered when they deemed me redundant. I developed a standard response that I delivered with the consistency of a broken record. "I'm sorry, but as Karen explained to me, my position was redundant, which means you don't need me anymore. Redundant means unnecessary, surplus, to requirements. I'm confident you'll work it out after all. You have such a capable team." I even started enjoying the calls, the way people enjoy watching disaster movies from the safety of their own couch. There's something deeply satisfying about watching the consequences of other people's bad decisions unfold in real time, especially when those people treated you like expendable office furniture for the better part of a decade. But the real prize, the crown jewel of corporate comeuppance, came on Friday afternoon when my phone rang and I saw the main office number displayed like a distress beacon from a sinking ship. I let it ring 3 times before answering, because anticipation is half the pleasure, Sarah. "This is Karen. I need to speak with you immediately." Her voice had undergone a complete transformation from the smug confidence of Tuesday's termination meeting to something that sounded suspiciously like terror, mixed with caffeine, withdrawal, and existential dread. "Karen, what a lovely surprise," I said, settling into my couch like I was about to watch my favorite movie. "How are things going with the restructuring? I hope the transition is going smoothly." "We need to discuss your separation agreement," she said, trying to regain some semblance of professional authority. "There may have been some oversights regarding system access and account management." I nearly choked on my coffee. Oversights. Like the oversight of not asking the person you're firing whether they're the only one who knows how to keep your business operational, that kind of oversight. Because if that's what you mean, Karen, I have to tell you, that wasn't an oversight. That was just really, really bad planning, Sarah. "Please," Karen said, and I could hear her swallowing what remained of her pride. "We may have underestimated the scope of your responsibilities. We'd like to discuss bringing you back as a consultant. Temporary arrangement, just to help with the knowledge transfer." I let that hang in the air, like smoke from a dumpster fire. "Knowledge transfer, Karen? That's interesting, because typically, knowledge transfer happens before you fire someone, not after your entire digital infrastructure has collapsed like a house of cards in an earthquake. But I appreciate the offer, really, I do. It shows real forward thinking on your part." The negotiation that followed was a symphony of corporate humiliation, conducted by someone who just realized they'd fired the orchestra and kept the conductor's baton. Karen started with my old salary, which I declined with the politeness of someone turning down a timeshare presentation. Then she offered a 20% increase, which I also declined because redundant people don't negotiate from positions of weakness. They set terms from positions of absolute necessity. When she finally asked what it would take, I leaned back and smiled at my ceiling like it was applauding my performance. "Well, Karen, since you're asking, I'd need a consulting contract at 4 times my previous hourly rate, with a minimum 6-month engagement payment up front for the first quarter, and a formal acknowledgement in writing that my termination was an error in corporate judgment. Oh, and I'll need that apology to be distributed company-wide, because apparently everyone needs to understand what redundant really means." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear Karen's soul departing her body through the phone connection. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was being squeezed through a straw, she whispered. Let me make some calls. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that I half expected the earth to spin in the opposite direction. They'd gone from holding all the cards to begging me to teach them the rules of the game they'd kicked me out of, and suddenly I wasn't just a former employee, I was a digital deity whose favor they desperately needed to curry if they wanted their business to survive the weekend. But here's the thing about being deemed redundant and then becoming indispensable. The relationship fundamentally changes. You're no longer an employee who can be taken for granted. You're a consultant who sets boundaries and a problem solver who charges premium rates for emergency services, and emergency was exactly what they had on their hands. Monday morning brought the kind of chaos that makes great television and even better revenge stories. I woke up to my phone buzzing like a caffeinated hummingbird, 23 missed calls, 18 voicemails, and enough text messages to write a novella about corporate incompetence. Karen's voicemails were a progression through the 5 stages of grief, starting with denial. This is just a temporary setback, and ending with bargaining that sounded like she was negotiating for the release of hostages, which in a digital sense, she absolutely was. The weekend had apparently been apocalyptic, without payroll running. Employees were threatening mass exodus, without customer database. Access sales had ground to a complete halt. The marketing automation had gone dark, like a digital blackout, and the inventory management system was displaying error messages in what appeared to be ancient hieroglyphics. Nobody could process orders, track shipments, or even access the company email accounts, because apparently, in 8 years, nobody had bothered to learn how anything actually worked. They'd just assumed that systems maintained themselves like some kind of digital fairy tale, where passwords grew on trees and servers ran on good intentions and corporate synergy. I didn't return the calls immediately because there's something beautiful about delayed gratification, especially when that gratification involves watching the consequences of other people's stupidity unfold in real time. Instead, I made myself a proper breakfast, checked the stock market, read 3 articles about digital transformation, irony, and generally enjoyed the sensation of being desperately needed by people who'd recently treated me like defective office equipment around noon. I finally called back. Karen answered before the first ring finished, like she'd been camping by the phone, practicing her apology. Sarah, thank God I've been trying to reach you all morning. We have a crisis situation. The entire company is essentially offline, and we need your immediate assistance. I considered this information with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary about corporate extinction events. That sounds serious, Karen. Have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? I heard what might have been a whimper. Sarah, this isn't a joke. We can't operate without these systems. Employees can't get paid. Customers can't place orders. We're hemorrhaging money by the hour. Well, Karen, that certainly sounds like a predicament. But as you explained to me, quite clearly, just last week, my position was redundant, which means you don't actually need me. Remember, redundant means unnecessary, surplus to requirements. I'm sure your very capable team can handle this. After all, you wouldn't have eliminated my position if you actually needed someone who understood these systems, right? There was a pause, so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Karen said something that made my entire month. Sarah, what would it take for you to come in today, just to assess the damage? No long-term commitment, just consultation. I smiled, like someone who just won the lottery, while their enemies got audited by the IRS. Well, Karen, I suppose I could take a look. But I'll need a few things first. That consulting contract we discussed, with payment up front. Second, a formal written apology, acknowledging that my termination was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my role. Third, access to whoever made the decision to eliminate my position, because we need to have a conversation about digital infrastructure and the true cost of ignorance. And fourth, I want a public acknowledgement to the entire staff that the current crisis could have been avoided if proper knowledge transfer protocols had been followed. Karen agreed to everything without hesitation, which told me exactly how desperate the situation had become. When people start accepting your terms without negotiation, you know you've achieved that perfect sweet spot between indispensable and expensive. My victory lap began that afternoon when I walked back through the same glass doors I'd been escorted out of just 1 week earlier, but this time I wasn't carrying a cardboard box full of personal effects. I was carrying a laptop bag in a consulting contract that made me more expensive per hour than most surgeons, and significantly more necessary for the patient's survival. The security guard who'd walked me out actually nodded respectfully this time and held the door open, like I was visiting royalty, which in the digital kingdom, I suppose I was. Karen met me in the lobby, wearing the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to pretend their house isn't burning down behind them. "Sarah," she said, extending her hand, like we were old colleagues. "Thank you so much for coming in on such short notice. We really appreciate your flexibility." I shook her hand with the firm grip of someone who knew exactly how much leverage they possessed. "Karen, it's my pleasure. After all, I'm here to help with the transition from redundant to absolutely critical. It should be an educational experience for everyone involved." Karen's smile flickered like a fluorescent bulb with electrical problems, but she maintained her composure because what other choice did she have? I walked through the office like a general, surveying a battlefield after the smoke had cleared, and every face told the same story: panic, confusion, and the slow, dawning realization that they'd just received a very expensive education about the difference between redundant and irreplaceable. Jessica from accounting looked up from her desk, where she'd apparently been stress-eating protein bars, and gave me a wave that was equal parts grateful and mortified. David from sales actually stood up and started a slow clap, which was awkward but deeply satisfying. Marcus from marketing just stared like he'd witnessed a resurrection, which in the digital sense, he absolutely had the ghost of their technological competence walking back from the dead to haunt their quarterly projections. I set up in the same conference room where Karen had delivered my redundancy notice 1 week earlier and opened my laptop with the ceremonial gravity of someone about to perform life-saving surgery. The damage assessment was even worse than I'd anticipated. Payroll system completely locked, customer database inaccessible, marketing automation. Platforms, secured email servers, compromised inventory management, displaying error messages that would make ancient Egyptians proud. Social media accounts frozen, cloud storage sealed tighter than a pharaoh's tomb. It was like they'd detonated a digital bomb in their own infrastructure, and then wondered why everything stopped working one by one. The department heads filed into the conference room, like defendants arriving at their own trial. Karen sat at the head of the table, desperately trying to project authority, while everyone else looked like they wanted to crawl under their desks and disappear into witness protection. The irony was so thick, you could package it and sell it as a case study in business schools across the country. "Well," I said, closing my laptop and surveying the room like a doctor about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. This is quite an impressive disaster you've created here. Let's have a conversation about what redundant actually means and how much it's going to cost to resurrect your digital infrastructure. The reckoning was about to begin, and I was just getting warmed up. Because the thing about being deemed redundant is that sometimes the only way to prove your value is to let people experience your absence. And reconstruction isn't charity. It's a premium service with premium pricing. Karen cleared her throat like she was about to make an announcement at a funeral, which, given the state of their systems, wasn't entirely inappropriate. Sarah, we've prepared a comprehensive consulting agreement based on your requirements. She slid a folder across the table with the reverence of someone presenting evidence at a murder trial. I opened it slowly, savoring the moment like fine wine or aged revenge. The contract was everything I'd demanded and more. 4 times my previous hourly rate, 6-month minimum engagement payment, upfront for the first quarter, and a formal acknowledgement that my termination had been what they diplomatically called a strategic miscalculation, which was corporate speak for we screwed up so badly it should be taught in business schools as a cautionary tale. But the real masterpiece was the addendum, a company-wide memo that would be distributed within 24 hours, explaining that the current operational difficulties were the direct result of inadequate succession planning and insufficient knowledge transfer protocols. It was beautiful, like watching someone dig their own grave with a golden shovel while apologizing for the inconvenience. I signed the contract with the flourish of someone who'd just negotiated their own resurrection, then looked around the room at the assembled faces of corporate humility. So I said, folding my hands like a professor, about to deliver a lecture, who'd like to explain to me how exactly you plan to maintain these systems after eliminating the person who built them. The silence was deafening. David from sales finally raised his hand tentatively, like a student who knew he was about to give the wrong answer. We thought the systems were automated, he said, in a voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. Automated, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a toxic cloud. David, that's fascinating, because automated systems still require administration, maintenance, security, updates, password management, backup protocols, and someone who understands how they work when they inevitably break down. But please tell me more about this automation theory of yours. David's face went through several colors, none of them flattering. I looked around the room at the other department heads who were suddenly finding their shoes absolutely fascinating. Jessica, I said, turning to accounting. How exactly were you planning to run payroll without access to the payroll system? She mumbled something about calling the software company's support line, which made me laugh. The kind of laugh that echoes in empty churches. Support line, Jessica. That's adorable, because support lines help you reset passwords and troubleshoot basic functionality. They don't hand out administrative access to people who can't prove they're authorized users. And since all the authorization documentation is locked in systems, you can't access well. You can see the circular nature of your predicament. Marcus, I continued, shifting my attention to marketing. How are you planning to manage the social media accounts and email campaigns? Marcus looked like he wanted to spontaneously combust, which would have been more useful than his actual answer. We were going to try to reset the passwords, he whispered. Try to reset them. I nodded thoughtfully. And when the security questions ask for information that's stored in systems you can't access, what was your backup plan? There wasn't one. Because there never is a backup plan when you fire the person who is the backup plan. The beautiful thing about being indispensable is that people don't realize how indispensable you are until you're gone. And by then, it's too late to pretend they could have managed without you. Karen finally spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of someone who just realized they'd bet the company on a hand of Go Fish. Sarah, we understand. We made an error in judgment. We're prepared to do whatever it takes to rectify the situation. Whatever it takes, I repeated, savoring the phrase like expensive chocolate. Well, Karen, since you're asking, I'll need complete administrative access to all systems, no restrictions, no oversight, no micromanagement. I'll also need dedicated workspace, access to all relevant personnel when I require information. And most importantly, I'll need a guarantee that any recommendations I make regarding system security, staffing, or operational procedures will be implemented without debate or delay. Karen nodded so vigorously, I thought her head might detach from her neck. Absolutely, whatever you think is necessary. Sarah, you're the expert here, and we clearly should have recognized that from the beginning, the expert. Yes, that's exactly what I was. And it had only taken them 1 week of digital apocalypse to figure it out. I spent the next hour walking them through the scope of the disaster, like a coroner explaining cause of death to grieving relatives. Every system that was down, every process that was broken, every workflow that had ground to a halt because they'd eliminated the person who understood how the pieces fit together. It was comprehensive, devastating, and entirely preventable. If they'd bothered to ask a single question about knowledge transfer before showing me the door, by the time I finished my assessment, the room looked like a group therapy session for people who just realized they'd accidentally burned down their own house while trying to save money on fire insurance. The damage was extensive, the recovery would be expensive, and the lessons learned would cost more than my entire previous annual salary. But here's the beautiful irony about being deemed redundant. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and sometimes that sense of humor comes with a consulting contract that pays you 4 times what they used to for the privilege of fixing the mess they created by getting rid of you. And as I packed up my laptop that first day, watching them realize that their week of independence had cost them more than a year of my employment, I couldn't help but smile, because the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting paid. And I was about to get paid very, very well for teaching them the difference between redundant and irreplaceable, 1 overpriced consulting hour at a time. Thanks for watching, you digital survivors. Hit that subscribe button, because the only thing better than being right is being right and getting paid handsomely for it. And trust me, this story is just getting started.